Hey everyone, the big scoop coming out of Silicon Valley, if you're not already aware, is this whole debacle with Google and then, YouTube. It's subsequent to the whole YouTube, the adpocalypse, and how you're seeing now a lot of these social media giants, these platforms that, the bulk of our population use to get a lot of information or to help try to spread information, right? Which social networking, hello, that's kind of the point of these platforms. But as you're seeing, they've gone very political in nature now, these Silicon Valley techs, right? The bigwigs that run these companies, these corporations. And as we all know, Google is the parent company of YouTube, owns YouTube. And, well, Alphabet is the parent company that owns it all, or that's the banner, that's the name they used. But you've seen the whole debacle with Twitter, like I said, with the YouTube, the adpocalypse, and now this whole thing that you're hearing about, the way now they're basically suggesting that it's not just that they're trying to suppress free speech or deplatform or demonetize particular content, in particular right-leaning content, or even anything that's outside of their particular ideologically driven preferences, which would be predominantly social justice warrior leftist types, right? Those are the people that seem to make up the bulk of these tech gurus in Silicon Valley. Whatever happened to the libertarians that were supposed to be among them? I guess they've been weeded out, right? guess they don't function well in these kind of environments, and that's why you see, and there's a whole new cohort of people that have taken over and assumed the roles of CEO and top-down management in these Silicon Valley tech firms. This is out of Gizmodo. And if you haven't heard all about this yet, well, you're going to now. Exclusive. Here's the full 10-page anti-diversity screed circulating internally at Google. And apparently it's been updated. Update, 7:25 p.m. Eastern Time. Google's new Vice President of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance, Danielle Brown, has issued her own memo to Google employees in response to the now viral memo, Google's ideological echo chamber. Brown's statement, obtained by Motherboard, can be found in full at the end of this article. A software engineer's 10-page screed against Google's diversity initiatives is going viral inside the company. Being shared on an internal meme network and Google+, the document's existence was first reported by Motherboard, and Gizmodo has obtained it in full. So Motherboard is a Vice subsidiary. In the memo, which is the personal opinion of a male Google employee and is titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, the author argues that women are underrepresented in tech not because they face bias and discrimination in the workplace, but because of inherent psychological differences between men and women. We need to stop assuming that gender gaps imply sexism, he writes, going on to argue that Google's educational programs for young women may be misguided. The post comes as Google battles a wage discrimination investigation by the U.S. Department of Labor, which has found that Google routinely pays women less than men in comparable roles. So Google's getting their own, like these social justice warriors. Yeah, they'll attack anyone, right? Gizmodo has reached out to Google for comment on the memo and how the company is addressing employee concerns regarding its content. We will update this article if we hear back. The text of the post is reproduced in full below with some minor formatting modifications. 2 charts and several hyperlinks are also omitted. Reply to public response and misrepresentation. I value diversity and inclusion, am not denying that sexism exists, and don't endorse using stereotypes. When addressing the gap in representation in the population, we need to look at population level differences in distributions. If we can't have an honest discussion about this, then we can never truly solve the problem. Psychological safety is built on moral respect and acceptance, but unfortunately our culture of shaming and misrepresentation is disrespectful and unacceptable of anyone outside its echo chamber. Despite what the public response seems to have been, I've gotten many personal messages from fellow Googlers expressing their gratitude for bringing up these very important issues, which they agree with, but would never have had the courage to say or defend because of our shaming culture and the possibility of being fired. This needs to change. Google's political bias has equated the freedom from offense with psychological safety, but shaming into silence is the antithesis of psychological safety. This silencing has created an ideological echo chamber where some ideas are too sacred to be honestly discussed. The lack of discussion fosters the most extreme and authoritarian elements of this ideology. Extreme. All disparities in representation are due to oppression. Authoritarian. We should discriminate to correct for this oppression. Differences in distributions of traits between men and women may in part explain why we don't have a 50% representation of women in tech and leadership. Discrimination to reach equal representation is unfair, divisive, and bad for business. Background. People generally have good intentions, but we all have biases which are invisible to us. Thankfully, open and honest discussion with those who disagree can highlight our blind spots and help us grow, which is why I wrote this document. Google has several biases, and honest discussion about these biases is being silenced by the dominant ideology. What follows is by no means the complete story, but it is a perspective that desperately needs to be told at Google. At Google, we talk so much about unconscious bias as it applies to race and gender, but we rarely discuss our moral biases. Political orientation is actually a result of deep moral preferences and thus biases. Considering that the overwhelming majority of the social sciences, media, and Google lean left, we should critically examine these prejudices. Oh, thank goodness for this person talking about these kind of things. Thank goodness that this is finally being brought up so that some discussions can hopefully take place instead of this constant suppression and pretending that, there isn't alternative voices out there. I mean, look at what it's doing to the fabric of society. It's ripping it into shreds. Left biases. Compassion for the weak. Disparities are due to injustices. Humans are inherently cooperative. Change is good, in brackets, unstable. Open, idealist. Right biases. Respect for the strong / authority. Disparities are natural and just. Humans are inherently competitive. Change is dangerous, in brackets, stable. Closed, pragmatic. Neither side is 100% correct, and both viewpoints are necessary for a functioning society, or, in this case, company. A company too far to the right may be too slow to react, overly hierarchical, and untrusting of others. In contrast, a company too far to the left will constantly be changing, in brackets, deprecating much-loved services. Over diversity, its interest, in brackets, ignoring or being ashamed in its core business, and overly trust its employees and competitors. Only facts and reason can shed light on these biases, but when it comes to diversity and inclusion, Google's left bias has created politically correct monoculture that maintains its hold by shaming dissenters into silence. This silence removes any checks against encroaching extremists and authoritarian policies. For the rest of this document, I'll concentrate on the extreme stance that all differences in outcomes are due to differential treatment and the authoritarian elements that's required to actually discriminate to create equal representation. Possible non-biased causes of the gender gap in tech. At Google, we're regularly told that implicit or unconscious and explicit biases are holding women back in tech and leadership. Of course, men and women experience biases, tech, and the workplace differently, and we should be cognizant of this, but it's far from the whole story. On average, men and women biologically differ in many ways. Oh, how dare you speak such truth? These differences aren't just socially constructed because, and here's a list of the reasons why he's saying because. They're universal across human cultures. They often have clear biological causes and links to prenatal testosterone. Biological males that were castrated at birth and raised as females often still identified and act like males. The underlying traits are highly heritable. They're exactly what we would predict from an evolutionary psychology perspective. Now, I'm not saying that all men differ from women in the following ways or that these differences are just. I'm simply stating that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership. Many of these differences are small, and there's significant overlap between men and women, so you can't say anything about an individual given these population level distributions, right? Generalization's fine, but individuals, there are exceptions to the norm, as we all know. Personality differences. Women on average have more openness directed towards feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas. Women generally also have a stronger interest in people rather than things relative to men, in brackets, also interpreted as empathizing versus systemizing. These two differences in part explain why women relatively prefer jobs in social or artistic areas. More men may like coding because it requires systemizing, and even within SWEs, comparatively more women work on front end, which deals with both people and aesthetics. Extroversion expressed as gregarious rather than assertiveness, also higher agreeableness. This leads to women generally having a harder time negotiating salary, asking for raises, speaking up, and leading. Note that these are just average differences and there's overlap between men and women, but this is seen solely as a woman's issue. This leads to exclusory programs like Stretch and swaths of men without support. Neuroticism, in brackets, higher anxiety, lower stress tolerance. This may contribute to the higher levels of anxiety women report on Googlegeist and to the lower number of women in high-stress jobs. Note that contrary to what a social constructionist would argue, research suggests that greater nation-level gender equality leads to psychological dissimilarity in men's and women's personality traits. Because as society becomes more prosperous and more egalitarian, innate dispositional differences between men and women have more space to develop, and the gap that exists between men and women in their personalities become wider. We need to stop assuming that gender gaps imply sexism. It's complete bullshit, of course. Men's higher drive for status. We always ask why we don't see women in top leadership positions, but we never ask why we see so many men in these jobs. These positions often require long, stressful hours that may not be worth it if you want a balanced and fulfilling life. Status is the primary metric that men are judged on, pushing many men into these higher paying, less satisfying jobs for the status that they entail. Note, the same forces that lead men into high-paying, high-stress jobs in tech and leadership cause men to take undesirable and dangerous jobs like coal mining, garbage collection, and firefighting, and suffer 93% of work-related deaths. Non-discriminatory ways to reduce the gender gap. Below, I'll go over some of the differences in distribution of traits between men and women that I've outlined in the previous section and suggest ways to address them to increase women's representation in tech and without resorting to discrimination. Google's already making strides in many of these areas, but I don't think it is still instructive to list them. Women on average show a higher interest in people and men in things. We can make software engineering more people-oriented with pair programming and more collaboration. Unfortunately, there may be limits to how people-oriented certain roles and Google can be, and we shouldn't deceive ourselves or students into thinking otherwise. Some of our programs to get female students into coding might be doing this. Women on average are more cooperative. Allow these exhibiting cooperative behavior to thrive. Recent updates to perf may be doing this to an extent, but maybe there's more we can do. This doesn't mean that we should remove all competitiveness from Google. Competitiveness and self-reliance can be valuable traits, and we shouldn't necessarily disadvantage those that have them. like what's been done in education. Women on average are more prone to anxiety. Make tech and leadership less stressful. Google already partly does this with its many stress reduction courses and benefits. Women on average look for more work-life balance, while men have a higher drive for status on average. Unfortunately, as long as tech and leadership remains high status, lucrative careers, men may disproportionately want to be in them. Allowing and truly endorsing, as part of our culture, part-time work that can keep more women in tech. The male gender role is currently inflexible. Feminism has made great progress in freeing women from the female gender role, but men are still very much tied to the male gender role. If we, as a society, allow men to be more feminine, then the gender gap will shrink. Although probably because men will leave tech and leadership for traditional feminine roles. Philosophically, I don't think we should do arbitrary social engineering of tech just to make it appealing to equal portions of both men and women. For each of these changes, we need principles, reasons for why it helps Google. That is, we should be optimizing for Google, with Google's diversity being a component of that. For example, currently, those trying to work extra hours or take extra stress will inevitably get ahead, and if we try to change that too much, it may have disastrous consequences. Also, when considering the costs and benefits, we should keep in mind that Google's funding is finite, so its allocation is more zero-sum than is generally acknowledged. The harm of Google's biases. I strongly believe in gender and racial diversity, and I think we should strive for more. However, to achieve a more equal gender and race representation, Google has created several discriminatory practices to try to create a level playing field. Think about this in any other situation, right? What you're doing is you're impeding the people that have worked harder or have natural traits or abilities that are better than their counterpart, whether it's male or female. And hindering those people is not a proper way to affect change. One of these, let's go through this list. Programs, mentoring, and classes only for people with a certain gender or race. A high priority queue and special treatment for diversity candidates. Hiring practices which can effectively lower the bar for diversity candidates by decreasing the false negative rate. Reconsidering any set of people if it is not diverse enough, but not showing that same scrutiny in the reverse direction. Clear confirmation bias. Setting org level OKRs for increased representation, which can incentivize illegal discrimination. These practices are based on false assumptions generated by our biases and can actually increase race and gender tensions. Of course, if you give any group special favor, yeah, you're affecting the psychology and harm and hindering that of those that you see that are superior in any way. Why would you want to do that to those kind of people? Like, it's just terrible. We're told by senior leadership that what we're doing is both the morally and economically correct thing to do, but without evidence, this is just veiled left ideology that can irreparably harm Google. Why we're blind. We all have biases and use motivated reasoning to dismiss ideas that run counter to our internal values. Just as some on the right deny science that runs counter to the God, humans, environment hierarchy, e.g. evolution and climate change, the left tends to deny science concerning biological difference between people, e.g. IQ and sex differences. Thankfully, climate scientists and evolutionary biologists generally aren't on the right. Unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of humanities and social scientists lean left, about 95%, which creates enormous confirmation bias, changes what's being studied, and maintains myths like social constructionism and the gender wage gap. Google's left-leaning makes us blind to this bias and uncritical of its results, which we're using to justify highly publicized or politicized programs. In addition to the left's affinity for those it sees as weak, humans are generally biased towards protecting females. As mentioned before, this likely evolved because males are biologically disposable and because women are generally more cooperative and agreeable than men. We have extensive government and Google programs, fields of study, and legal and social norms to protect the women. But when a man complains about a gender issue, affecting men, he's labeled as a misogynist and whiner. Nearly every difference between men and women is interpreted as a form of women's oppression. As with many things in life, gender differences are often a case of grass being greener on the other side. Unfortunately, taxpayer and Google's money is spent to water only one side of the lawn. Oh, so true. The same compassion for those seen as weak creates political correctness, which constrains discourse and is complacent to the extremely sensitive PC authoritarians that use violence and shaming to advance their cause. While Google hasn't harbored the violent leftist protests that we're seeing in universities, the frequent shaming in TGIF and in our culture has created the same silence, psychologically unsafe environment. I hope it's clear that I'm not saying that diversity is bad, that Google or society is 100% fair, that we shouldn't try to correct for existing biases, or that minorities have the same experience of those of the majority. My larger point is that we have an intolerance for ideas and evidence that don't fit a certain ideology. So true. I'm also not saying that we should restrict people to certain gender roles. I'm advocating for quite the opposite. Treat people as individuals, not as just another member of their group. Tribalism. Oh, that sounds so good. This person sounds very in tune to classical liberalism and libertarianism. My concrete suggestions are to demoralize diversity. As soon as we start to moralize an issue, we stop thinking about it in terms of costs and benefits, dismiss anyone that disagrees as immoral, and harshly punish those we see as villains to protect the victims. Stop alienating conservatives. Viewpoint diversity is arguably the most important type of diversity, and political orientation is one of the most fundamental and significant ways in which people view things differently. In highly progressive environments, conservatives are a minority that feel like they need to stay in the closet to avoid open hostility. We should empower those with different ideologies to be able to express themselves. Alienating conservatives is both non-inclusive and generally bad business because conservatives tend to be higher in consciousness, which is required for much of the drudgery and maintenance work characteristics of a mature company. Confront Google's biases. I've mostly concentrated on how our biases cloud our thinking about diversity and inclusion, but our moral biases are farther reaching than that. I would start by breaking down Googlegeist scores by political orientation and personality to give a fuller picture into how our biases are affecting our climate. Stop restricting programs and classes to certain genders or races. These discriminatory practices are both unfair and divisive. Instead, focus on some of the non-discriminatory practices I outlined. Have an open and honest discussion about the costs and benefits of our diversity program. Discriminating just to increase the representation of women in tech is as misguided and biased as mandating increases for women's representation in the homeless, work-related and violent deaths, prisons, and school dropouts. There's currently very little transparency into the extent of our diversity programs, which keeps it immune to criticism from those outside its ideological echo chamber. These programs are highly politicized, which further alienates non-progressives. I realize that some of our programs may be precautions against government accusations of discrimination, but that can easily backfire since they incentivize illegal discrimination. Focus on psychological safety, not just race/gender diversity. We should focus on psychological safety, which has shown positive effects and should hopefully not lead to unfair discrimination. We need psychological safety and shared values to gain the benefits of diversity. Having representative viewpoints is important for those designing and testing our products, but the benefits are less clear for those more removed from the UX. De-emphasize empathy. I've heard several calls for increased empathy on diversity issues. While I strongly support trying to understand how and why people think the way they do, relying on effective empathy, feeling another's pain, causes us to focus on anecdotes, favor individuals similar to us, and harbor other irrational and dangerous biases. Being emotionally unengaged helps us better reason about the facts. Prioritize intention. Our focus on microaggressions and other unintentional transgressions increases our sensitivity, which is not universally positive. Sensitivity increases both our tendency to take offense and our self-censorship, leading to authoritarian policies. Speaking up without the fear of being harshly judged is central to psychological safety. But these practices can remove that safety by judging unintentional transgressions. Microaggression training incorrectly and dangerously equates speech with violence and isn't backed by evidence. Be open about the science of human nature. Once we acknowledge that not all differences are socially constructed or due to discrimination, we open our eyes to a more accurate view of the human condition, which is necessary if we actually want to solve problems. Reconsider making unconscious bias training mandatory for promo committees. We haven't been able to measure any effect of our unconscious bias training, and it has the potential for overcorrecting or backlash, especially if made mandatory. Some of the suggested methods of the current training are likely useful, but the political bias of the presentation is clear from the factual inaccuracies and the examples shown. Spend more time on the many other types of biases besides stereotypes. Stereotypes are much more accurate and responsive to new information than the training suggests. Brackets. I'm not advocating for using stereotypes. I just pointing out the factual inaccuracy of what's said in the training. And now we get into the list at the bottom of this article. This document is mostly written from the perspective of Google's Mountain View campus. I can't speak about other offices or countries. 2. Of course, I may be biased and only see evidence that supports my viewpoint. In terms of political biases, I consider myself a classical liberal and strongly value individualism and reason. I'd be very happy to discuss any of the document further and provide more citations. 3. Throughout the document, by tech, I mostly mean software engineering. 4. For heterosexual romantic relationships, men are more strongly judged by status and women by beauty. Again, this has biological origins and is culturally universal. 5. Stretch bold, B-O-L-D, CSSI, engineering practicum, in brackets to an extent, and several other Google-funded internal and external programs are for people with a certain gender or race. 6. Instead, set Google Geist OKRs potentially for certain demographics. We can increase representation at an org level by either making it a better environment for certain groups, in brackets, which would be seen in survey scores, or discriminating based on a protected status, brackets, which is illegal, and we've seen it done. Increased representation OKRs can incentivize the latter and create zero-sum struggles between orgs. 7. Communism promised to be both morally and economically superior to capitalism, but every attempt became morally corrupt and an economic failure. As it became clear that the working class of the liberal democracies wasn't going to overthrow their capitalist oppressors, the Marxist intellectuals transitioned from class warfare to gender and race politics. The core oppressed dynamics remained, but now the oppressor is the white, straight, cisgendered patriarchy. 8. Ironically, IQ tests were initially championed by the left when meritocracy meant helping the victims of aristocracy. 9. Yes, in a national aggregate, women have lower salaries than men for a variety of reasons. For the same work, though, women get paid just as much as men. Considering women spend more money than men and that salary represents how much the employee sacrifices, e.g., more hours, stress, and danger, we really need to rethink our stereotypes around power. 10. The traditionalist system of gender does not deal well with the idea of men needing support. Men are expected to be strong, to not complain, and to deal with problems on their own. Men's problems are more often seen as personal failings rather than victimhood. Due to our gendered idea of agency, this discourages men from bringing attention to their issues, whether individual or group-wide issues, for fear of being seen as whiners, complainers, or weak. 11. Political correctness is defined as the avoidance of forms of expression of action that are perceived to exclude, marginalize, or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged or discriminated against, which makes it clear why it's a phenomenon of the left and a tool of authoritarians. Updated 7:25 p.m. Eastern Time. Google's new Vice President of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance, Daniel Brown, issued the following statement in response to the internal employee memo. Googlers, I'm Danielle, Google's brand new VP of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance. I started just a couple of weeks ago, and I had hoped to take another week or so to get the lay of the land before introducing myself to you all. But given the heated debate we've seen over the past few days, I feel compelled to say a few words. Many of you have read an internal document shared by someone in our engineering organization expressing views on the natural abilities and characteristics of different genders, as well as whether one can speak freely of these things at Google. And like many of you, I found that it advanced incorrect assumptions about gender. I'm not going to link to it here, as it's not a viewpoint that I or this company endorses, promotes, or encourages. Diversity and inclusion are a fundamental part of our values and the culture we continue to cultivate. We are unequivocal in our belief that diversity and inclusion are critical to our success as a company, and will continue to stand for that and be committed to it for the long haul. As Ari Balog said in his internal G plus post, building an open, inclusive environment is core to who we are and the right thing to do. Enough said. Google has taken a strong stand on this issue by releasing its demographic data and creating a company-wide OKR on diversity and inclusion. Strong stands elicit strong reactions. Changing a culture is hard, and it's often uncomfortable. But I firmly believe Google is doing the right thing, and that's why I took the job. Part of building an open, inclusive environment means fostering a culture in which those with alternative views, including different political views, feel safe sharing their opinions. But that discourse needs to work alongside the principles of equal employment found in our code of conduct, policies, and anti-discrimination laws. I've been in the industry for a long time, and I can tell you that I've never worked at a company that has so many platforms for employees to express themselves. TGIF, Memigan, Internal G+, thousands of discussion groups. I know this conversation doesn't end with my email today. I look forward to continuing to hear your thoughts as I settle in and meet with Googlers across the company. Thanks, Danielle. And that's the end of this article. I know it was long, but this is something that and a lot of people may not want to listen to the entirety of this video, and they may only want to get some small takeaways from it. So let me just say right now, political biases should not exist, on these kind of platforms. And that's just think about it, folks. Allowing the free market of ideas to flourish. That's the best. I mean, their ideas, their words, right? We're not talking about violence or means of oppression. We're talking about allowing a wide range of varying opinions and preferences. And whether it's ideologically driven or just based on principles that each of us hold dear and near to our own heart, and how we choose to function and cohabitate with our fellow humans in our particular geographical area that we live in, or even in the world as a whole, because what we're talking about now, when you're talking about the internet, is worldwide, right? So we know that there's a huge variance on ideological, sociological, psychological, physical, experiences and preferences. The ranges are vast. But if you want to get the best of the best, right, and you want to learn and disseminate the difference between, dogmatic ideology that's based on using it for wrong methods or for authoritarian means, the only way you can weed that stuff out is by having all the evidence presented to you, not evidence from one side of the equation. In a debate, if you're trying to learn things and come to a good, logically deduced decision, you have to hear that broad range and diverse opinions and ideologies, because without it, if you're only told things from one side of a political spectrum, or for one area of a political spectrum, then you're leaving out too many other variables to be able to say that you've actually come to any truly objective or logically consistent conclusion or result from what you've heard, from what you've been told. By Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, by these bigwigs in the tech industry out in Silicon Valley trying to manipulate and distort and centrally plan what people can hear because of their particular preferences or their particular ideology, they're actually causing more harm than any kind of good that they may be. And I mean, some of these people probably have good intentions, no doubt about it. I have no doubt in my mind that some of these people do have good intentions, but their ideologically driven preferences and edicts are preventing them from seeing the other side, from seeing that the grass can be green on the other side as well. It might not necessarily be greener, but you have to at least acknowledge and recognize that, hey, they can grow green grass as well. Allow people to see your grass, your lawn, and allow people to see their lawn. And let other people determine with their own minds which lawn that they think they'd rather lay out on, or which one lawn that they find might be greener. You know, the free market ideas, and that's the thing with you Silicon people, Silicon Valley tech type people. Did you not learn any of this stuff? You know, free market ideas. A lot of you people have relied on capitalism as a means to create these gigantic platforms that you now have the ability to distort and manipulate the population at large. Right? People were willing to give you a chance. And a lot of the people that invest in your company would probably be from the right side of the political spectrum. Or some of the people that made your business very successful might have been from the right side of the political spectrum. Much more economically astute than the creative types on the left side, right? You need both to make that happen. But if you forsake those people, then yeah, you might have the creative bunch, but that creativity will never turn into reality without the productive bunch, right? The analytical bunch. The economically driven bunch. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.